So if you've heard me teach any length of time, whether in these videos or on a Sunday, you've probably put together by now that I tend to follow what's called the lectionary. The lectionary is a traditional cycle of readings um, that have been selected by people much smarter than me, and many churches throughout the world and throughout history have gone through kind of this cycle of readings together. And I like the idea that many communities, many different types of people are trying to figure out what God might have for us in this same set of readings on any given Sunday. Um, that said, there are Sundays when I look at these readings and I feel called to teach on a particular one that I feel a little stuck. I feel a little ambushed by the teaching. And I bring this up because that is very much this week. This is not a passage I felt particularly drawn to. It did not feel like a very fun passage to teach on, but it's the one that I feel like we may have something to learn from. There is kind of a famous anecdote about the composer Ludwig van Beethoven that I think sets the stage, kind of gives us a sense of what Jesus is trying to do in this strange kind of confrontational passage in Luke 12 that we're going to look at in just a second. Beethoven, when he was kind of first in the big city of Vienna, when he was first trying to make a name for himself, was a little famous because he realized that not all of the aristocracy there, not all the people who were hiring him, took music quite as seriously he did, and he was famous for a particular joke he would play. He would go to a salon, they would hire him to play, and so he'd start playing something very pretty, something kind of slow and sleepy, and he'd watch the room till the conversation was kind of lulling. He'd wait till everyone seemed sleepy and kind of had forgotten about him. And then when he thought the moment was right, he would crash his forearm down on the piano keys, make this loud, dissonant sound of all these keys being played at once, and he just watched the whole room jump and look back and find out what is wrong with this, crazy young man. And I think Jesus and I think God at times have to do something very similar with the world or with the church when we are starting to get a little sleepy. Particularly, I think when we're starting to get a little sleepy on the job, right? God has expectations for the way we represent Him, the type of work we do in His name in the world. And there are times when we can maybe get a little lulled and kind of forget about that. We're falling asleep on the job. And I think Jesus in this passage, like Beethoven, is crashing his forearm down on the piano keys to wake everyone up to get our attention. So it feels like a little bit of an unusual passage here in Luke 12, starting in verse 49. But I think God is trying to get our attention in some ways. So Jesus starts out in this teaching by saying, I came to cast fire upon the earth. How I wish it were already ablaze. I have a baptism I must experience, and how distressed I am until it's completed. Do you think I've come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, I have come instead to bring division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. Father will square off against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, and mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. This feels like a weird passage to me. I've come to cast fire on the earth, to burn things, to destroy things. Do you think I've come to bring peace? No, I tell you, I come to bring division. This, it's a surprising passage coming from the man who told us his mission very specifically was to heal and to bring people out of darkness, to restore, and whose nickname is the Prince of Peace. And so Jesus here has been butting heads quite a bit, just publicly with the religious leaders at the time, and he's frustrated because he cannot seem to get through. He cannot seem to be heard by them the way he really desires to be heard. And so I think he's using this kind of shocking language because he says, look, something is coming that there's just no really going back from. It is just kind of a pivotal point, a crossroads where we have to make a choice. And that's what he's referring to when he talks to this baptism he must experience. Baptism not in the sense of washing of the way of, but baptism, the original kind of root verb, is the idea of being drowned, of being overwhelmed, to being completely smothered by something. And he knows that the cross is coming. Again, I can't imagine how maddening it must be for Jesus who comes down wanting to heal people and make people whole and invite them into freedom, to find many, many people who want nothing to do with kind of this kingdom of peace that he is offering. And the cross that he's heading towards, to being publicly killed, humiliated, taking on death in sin itself, and of course ultimately freeing humanity from those things in the resurrection. But it presents kind of a crossroads, as I said. Either you're in on this cross thing, either your sins die on it, either you acknowledge God's ways in the world, or you demand there is no problem, I'm going to do things my own way. And so the cross in so many ways becomes almost like the gable of a roof, right? Or maybe even better, the continental divide. When rain, when water hits the top of that roof, hits those mountains, it begins this long journey towards a very different end, a different ocean, right? And God is wanting us to go his way, to go a certain way, except that there is something deeply wrong within humanity, deeply wrong in the world and the systems we've created. And it needs something dramatic, even more dramatic than Beethoven's crashing piano notes. It needs the death of God himself to make things whole again. And is Jesus offering a way of peace? Absolutely. But he's also, I think, very open-eyed about the fact that not everyone is going to want in on this kingdom. Not everyone is going to want to have, their innermost beings exposed and called out as lacking. And so Jesus, in this moment, is warning that, you know what, I'm practically, I desire to bring peace. I desire to bring wholeness. And yet that is not going to be the choice everyone makes. And God respects our choices. And so, in fact, this decisive bringing of peace, of a different way of being in the world, in fact, is going to reap a lot of division. It's going to break families. It's going to, it's going to do what fire does in many ways. Fire can do kind of two things. It can completely consume something if it's flammable, or it can kind of refine, burn away the impurities, and bring something even better on the other side. Neither of those processes, I suspect, feel very good, but that is what Jesus is inviting us into here. And again, I don't think that Jesus is thrilled about this. I just think he's being a realist, acknowledging not everyone is going to want in on his work of healing and wholeness. And again, he respects that. There's kind of a quote he's making here in the language of the very specific father against son, son against father, daughter-in-law versus mother-in-law. Is probably quoting Micah 7, in which Micah is saying, look, you want to know how deeply broken the world is. It's this lament that things are not right. Look, even our families are shattered and broken. And Jesus is probably quoting this, saying, like, he's not thrilled about this. He's lamenting the way things are, but he's also pretty open-eyed about kind of how he will be received, how people will react to him. This passage is one that always reminds me very distinctly of a friend of mine from college. This friend was a Saudi Arabian exchange student. He'd come to study, I think, engineering in the States for a couple years before heading back home. And I don't remember how it got started, but he and I did start talking about kind of religion, about our faiths, about the fact that I was doing my best to follow Jesus. And he had grown up and he was in a family that believed in Islam. And over the course of our conversations, he became increasingly drawn, I think, to Jesus and to God and his way of being in the world. And I remember one day seeing him in the lunchroom, and he just had his head in his hands and he was down, and I walked over and I said, hey, what's going on? And he said, I stayed up late in the night, and I think that Jesus is in fact God. I think I'm going to give my life to him. I'm going to follow. And I said, oh, well, congratulations. That's a huge decision. I just want to acknowledge what a big step you've made. And he kind of nodded his head and says, yeah, thank you. But I just got off the phone with my father, and I told him that I'd made this decision. And his response was, okay, don't bother coming back. You are not welcome here at home anymore. You are no longer my son, and hung up on him. And so I don't want to make light of the fact that this division, this breaking that Jesus offered in the world, has some real teeth to it. It really can hurt some people. And to this day, I don't really know what happened with my friend. I didn't see him much after that. But this division, this, like I said, this kind of continental divide that the cross is, of will you go about it God's way or another way, is one that is very real. It is one that has very important impact on many people's lives. And so that teaching continues in this next section, where Jesus continues to vent this frustration that these people just will not listen to him well, will not look well, and have different priorities. So in 54, he says, Jesus also said to the crowds, "When you see a cloud forming in the west, you immediately say it's going to rain, and indeed it does. And when a south wind blows, you say a heat wave's coming, and it does. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret weather conditions on earth and in the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret the present time? And why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you're going to court with your accuser, make your best effort to reach a settlement along the way. Otherwise, your accuser may bring you before the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer throw you in prison. I tell you, you won't get out until you've paid the very last cent." So I was really baffled by what on earth Jesus is talking about with this. We know how to watch the weather, and then now we're going to court with someone accusing us. What on earth does this have to do with this sad fact that his presence is going to cause division in the world? And Jesus, I think, here is angry because, yes, he is offering this choice of healing, of wholeness, at a cost, to himself primarily, back to the world, and people aren't even paying attention. He says, look, you're more willing to look at the weather and figure out kind of its significance than you are to look at the times we live in, right? And Jesus came at a very specific time in history. I don't think God came by accident when he did. The people were oppressed by the Roman Empire. There were streams of religion, there were streams of thinking everywhere, and God's people were in a crossroads of all these different influences. They had some very different reactions to it. And into this kind of maelstrom of wondering what is going on politically, what is God up to in the world, Jesus lands plop down, and he just basically rejects kind of all the options on the table in the way he approaches things. And I think that is what the rejection comes from so much of the time, despite the fact that it was so obvious looking at the politics, the kind of spiritual climate at the time, the fact that the devil seemed to be more active than any time. It seemed like something big was going on, and all most people wanted was to go back to the good old days. They were hoping to have their own political freedom again. They were hoping it would just be like in some of the best of the Old Testament times. And Jesus, again, is saying, come on, wake up, look well at the world we are in. We are not going back to times like this. Times have changed. The need is too big out there, and that's one of the things he's angry about, right? The fact that people desired so strongly to go backwards, they weren't looking at the people who were around them, the need that was around them all the time, which is why he was so openly embraced by so many people who were rejected by the rest of society. And I think this weird story about, walking down the street with an accuser, before it's too late, before you get to the judge, pay attention to what is around you, is what he's saying. He's like, look, make good on this, fix this while there is still time. There is some urgency. We don't get to, diddle around forever waiting to get this thing right when God has such a strong desire, when Jesus in his own time has such a strong desire for them. And I think this has a good challenge to us nowadays. Like, okay, do we really know the times and the world that we live in? Would we even be able to recognize what God was up to in the context, in the culture we live in, if it wasn't what we wanted to see? And I think that's a question that will always haunt the church. It's one that needs to haunt us today. And I felt like, okay, do you just leave us hanging? What's going there? And the answer is yes, Jesus does just leave us hanging in some ways, but he goes home. He brings us home one more time at the beginning of chapter 13. Some who were present on the occasion told Jesus about the Galileans whom Pilate had killed off while they were offering sacrifices. So, I think they are trying to connect with him and show that the current events does have some meaning, right? They are paying attention to the time. Well, what about those, people who were killed for no real reason? And he replied, Do you think that the suffering of these Galileans proves that they are more sinful than other Galileans? No. But unless you change your hearts and lives, you'll die like they did. What about those 18 people who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them? Do you think that they were more guilty of wrongdoing than everyone else who lives in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you change your hearts and lives now, you will die like they did. And I think that he warns us of temptation there. If he invites us in to say, look at the times you live in, know the culture well, know where God is working and where the needs are, right? Don't fall into the trap of trying to make everything a simple, easy cause and effect of spiritual matters, right? We still fall into this. Oh, this happened because XYZ. And it often comes down to, oh, I'm comfortable because I deserve it because I'm more righteous than they do. We see this, left and right in the world today. And Jesus is saying, don't go that way. Here's the direction I want you to go. And he tells this final little parable. So Jesus told the parable. A man owned a fig tree planted in his vineyard. He came looking for fruit on it, but found none. And he said to his gardener, look, I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree for the past 3 years, and I've never found any. Cut it down. Why should it continue depleting the soil's nutrients? And the gardener responded, Lord, give it 1 more year. I'll dig around it. I'll give it fertilizer. Maybe it will produce fruit next year. If not, then you can cut it down. So as I said, Jesus does leave us hanging, does leave us with this question of how are we going to respond? Because I think rather than trying to figure out cause and effect to justify ourselves, Jesus says, okay, if you know the times that you live in, do you know what fruit could look like? Do you know what growth and beauty and God's presence can look like in the midst of those times? We live in a very different world than we did even a few years ago. Do we recognize how God is moving in that world? Do we have a sense of our responsibility in it? Or do we need God to slam his forearm on the piano and wake us up to look around at the opportunities and the things he is doing and inviting us into? So I think if we look at this passage, yeah, it's a wild passage. Jesus is pissed off in this passage. The fact that people are rejecting the wholeness, this kingdom of healing and wholeness and light that he is offering. He's not pissed off because they are, but he's pissed off because of the lesser versions, I think, that they would rather accept than the real thing that he is doing. So again, he points out that the cross will be a point of division. You have to make a choice. Which side of the continental divide are you going to fall in? Are we heading toward the ocean that acknowledges Jesus' work in the cross and wants to be in on his kind of program for humanity? Or are we going to go our own way, head toward that other ocean? If that's the case, the way we make those choices, that road we walk, is always going to take place in a specific culture, in a specific context, with a specific ways that we can serve, that we can bring, just kind of who we are to God and to people. And then that kind of last section is, it will hopefully lead to very specific fruit in our lives. And so I think the question I felt left with is, if we are that tree, if we have this opportunity to produce fruit into our lives, wherever you are, wherever you find yourself, the question is, okay, what are we supposed to be doing as the church communal? What does fruit look like in our current context, in our current culture and politics and the world economy going the ways and the wars that are out there and the diseases, right? In the midst of that, God is good. God is bringing hope and life and peace. What does it look like for the church to be bearing fruit right now? And then maybe more microscopically, what does it look like for me? What fruit is God desiring from my life? What spiritual fruit, what giftings, what blessings is it he's wanting to bring about in the midst of this context, in the midst of it? So I think, I don't know, but I want to start praying about that. I want to start wondering. I want to start being wide-eyed, because I want to fall on that side of the thing. I know there's probably some purification to come. I know it's not always going to go well. If many people rejected God, maybe I'll get rejected too. But at the end of the day, I think no matter the context, God can bring wholeness and blessing. He can bring that spiritual fruit. And so I think I want to look at my own life and say, okay, where is the opportunity, God? Would you help me live into that?